So hello, and welcome to this plenary session of the International Network for the Study of Science and Belief in Societies annual conference. My name is Carissa Sharp. I'm a research fellow at the University of Birmingham, and I am leading the Science, Knowledge, and Belief in Society Research Group, or SKBS. This event marks the launch of the SKBS within the University of Birmingham's Institute for STEM in Culture and Society. SKBS is a multidisciplinary research group whose work spans a diverse range of subjects, including history, philosophy, sociology, psychology, and education. Our research examines the relationship between science and religion in relation to individuals' lived experiences and cutting-edge social issues, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, which leads me into the topic of today's plenary session on science, belief, and society in the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought to the forefront many issues involving science, belief, and society. Widespread narratives have revolved around the role of religion and belief in affecting people's attitudes towards and adoption of health behaviors on local and global levels. Today, we have a very exciting lineup of 4 scholars from the INSBS network, whose research has touched on various aspects of science, belief, and society in the COVID-19 pandemic. Very excited to be able to bring them together in this panel today. So just a brief introduction to the format that we're going to have for today. I'll introduce each speaker before they give a 5 to 10 minute introduction to their research and their kind of thoughts on this particular area of study. And we'll run through them back to back and then open up the floor for a Q&A. As this is a Zoom webinar, please either put your question into the chat, or once the speakers have finished talking, you can use the raise hand function and we can unmute you if you would like to ask your question that way. Fantastic. So with that, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Tom Eichner. Tom is a senior lecturer in religion and science in the School of Historical and Philosophical Inquiry at the University of Queensland.
Thank you. All right. Well, several years ago, I began researching anti-vaccination online messages, media persuasion, as well as religion and vaccine hesitancy in Australia as part of a research fellowship. And of course, what I didn't realize then was that in the last year of the project, I'd find myself in the midst of a global pandemic that would push the subject of vaccines and anti-vaccination into the limelight. Now, at the start of the pandemic, I was actually working on 2 related projects. One was a University of Queensland vaccine website called UQ Vaccination Choice. And the other was a new massive open online course called AVAX 101, Anti-Vaccination and Vaccine Hesitancy. And as the pandemic measures started to ramp up in Australia, various people who I was working with on both projects stated that likely now my research and vaccine advocacy would no longer be needed. Because in a pandemic, they said, when there would be an unprecedented demand for vaccines, people would stop expressing vaccine doubts. I disagreed then, saying that the opposite would likely happen. And in a public online seminar for the Queensland University of Technology's Centre for Data Science Network at the beginning of the pandemic, before there was any COVID-19 vaccine in immediate sight, I said that what we'll probably continue to see is likely a ramping up of and spread of counter-vaccine conspiracy narratives and misinformation and distrust. Now, I thought this because, for one, research has found that people tend to be more hesitant about new vaccines in general. And 2, in having studied 8 years of Australian anti-vaccination online media, I found that there were 3 central persuasion focal points that are communicated to audiences, which I have described as distrust, danger, and confidence. And the distrust theme, which is centered upon conspiratorial plot lines and distrust of authorities, was by far the most common topic. And this includes telling audiences that their health choices are being restricted by an increasingly undemocratic and untrustworthy government, which is working in a conspiracy with Big Pharma. While at the same time, the real truth about vaccines is being suppressed worldwide. I was actually surprised that conspiratorial distrust messages like these were the most common, as I'd actually expected that narratives of vaccine dangers, vaccine risks, of fear messaging about vaccines, that they would be the most frequently expressed, but they weren't. So with that in mind, I surmised that conspiratorial narratives expressing distrust would end up being front and center in the pandemic, which would play upon people's pre-existent distrust of governments and pharmaceutical companies and their uneasiness around new vaccines. Additionally, I went on to analyze two nationally representative surveys in Australia. One that I ran, which sought to investigate vaccine hesitancy in relation to religion and other demographics. And another was the Australian data set from the world's largest study into people's perceptions of science, including vaccines. And the analysis provides additional insights, I think, into religion, science, vaccine hesitancy in society, particularly in the Australian context, but which likely, I think, has more broad relevance. In short, the first takeaway from the survey data is that religion and vaccine hesitancy is complex. We found that less than 6% of respondents identified that they had religious reasons for being hesitant about vaccines. Religious affiliation was also not strongly correlated with vaccine hesitancy. So being religious or identifying as being spiritual doesn't have a strong correlation with being vaccine hesitant. However, at the same time, we did find that the survey respondents who expressed doubts about vaccine safety and effectiveness were still more likely to identify as being religious and or spiritual than the non-vaccine hesitant cohort. So participants didn't say that they had religious reasons for being vaccine hesitant, but a higher proportion of vaccine hesitant individuals identified with being religious or spiritual. With further analysis, we also found that there was an overall split between two main types of vaccine hesitant individuals. The first being people who are more politically liberal leaning, who self-identify as spiritual and or non-religious. And more commonly, two, politically conservative people who self-identify as being religious. So we call these two kinds of vaccine hesitant groups the spiritual and non-religious political progressives and religious political conservatives. So we get two rather different sets of people, both expressing vaccine hesitancy in Australia. But there was one important marker that united them both, who they tended to say that they trusted and distrusted. So we found statistically significant associations between negative attitudes toward vaccines and distrust in federal government. People with vaccine hesitancy, both spiritual and non-religious political progressives, as well as religious political conservatives, together demonstrated the lowest levels of trust in government. Additionally, people who are vaccine hesitant are less likely to trust in the courts and legal system, and they were less likely to trust in business and industry. And in terms of trust, the data revealed that respondents with negative attitude towards vaccines were also more likely to trust in traditional healers, alternative medicine. Now, when it comes to vaccine hesitancy in religion, there was another finding that we found rather interesting, and that was that attitudes toward Jews and Muslims in particular were found to be increasingly negative in correlation with increased levels of vaccine doubt. So people who were most skeptical of about vaccine effectiveness, for instance, were the most likely to have negative attitudes toward both Jews and Muslims, but no other religious traditions. And specifically, it was non-religious vaccine doubters who reported the most negative attitudes. So what's the upshot for science, belief, and society in the pandemic? even though vaccine hesitant individuals were more likely to be religious or identify as spiritual, religious beliefs aren't really pinpointed by participants as being the cause of vaccine hesitancy. Plus, in the overall participant pool, religious affiliation isn't actually strongly correlated with vaccine doubts. Instead, a statistical common denominator amongst the vaccine hesitant, whether they are spiritual and non-religious political progressives or religious political conservatives, is who they trust and distrust. Trust seems to be a key proxy measure of vaccine hesitancy, both for religious and non-religious individuals. So when we're looking at anti-vax media or religion and vaccination in the pandemic, what we really need to be keeping an eye on, in my mind, is keeping an eye out for who people trust and distrust. And this is what I call the trust proxy of vaccine hesitancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was fascinating. Now we have Bankole Falade. Bankole is a research fellow with the Center for Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology at Stellenbosch University. He is also a visiting fellow in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Sciences at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Bankole, are you, yeah, okay, great.
Can you see me now? Okay. My thought is more qualitative. I think I'll look at the quantitative later. My talk is about religious communications in Africa in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, which severely affected the observance of religious obligations, setting belief against new science and faith leaders against each other as a new common sense about the disease evolved. I argue, however, that rather than outright rejection or diffusion of new scientific knowledge, leaders and followers opted to accommodate science into their belief systems as portrayed in their communications about the disease. First, I want to look at leaders who blame sin and the devil to elevate God. Pastor Adeboye said at the onset of the crisis that God told him that the virus will be there until the whole world has had a compulsory holiday, until he proves to the whole world that he's God. David Oyedepo said the church where healing takes place all around the world is one that's shut down. The marketplace where they collect diseases is the one that is open. The devil is surely targeting the people. Samson Ayorinde, the president of the Christian Association of Nigeria, said the pandemic is a consequence of the arrogance of humans, as people say anything today against God and against the word of God. There are those leaders who blame science to elevate God. Chris Oyakhilome said that the COVID-19 and 5G network are part of the Antichrist plan for a new world order. Asking, what is the reason for social distancing? Is it not because of infection? That's the easiest way to prevent protests. Sheikh Yahya said COVID-19 is an international deceit and Western conspiracy against Muslims. He said the virus is a lie. There were leaders who believed the science, opted to accommodate it into their belief systems. Bakari said closure is not necessary to prevent hunger. So the closure is necessary to prevent hunger and not to undermine the church. The church is not the building, but the saints of God. Ashimolo described COVID-19 as a pandemic which must be dealt with as such. If coronavirus is caused by 5G, Why is it in Oyakilome's village? He was referring to his fellow Christian pastor. Pastor Adeyemi recalled the Spanish flu global epidemic of 1918 in Nigeria. They closed churches, they closed mosques, they shut schools, they shut down markets. This is not strange to him. Reverend Father Ejike Mbaka said, under the priestly anointing, I release healing to the entire world. He asked God to release the drug that will cure COVID. The African traditional priests on their own offered spiritual sacrifice to appease gods of the land and deities with a view to cleansing the land of the virus. The followers opted to follow God and science. A Muslim interviewed said, before the outbreak, I used to go to the mosque and join the imam for prayers and learn more about the Holy Scriptures. You were surrounded by others. Now I have to learn to pray with only my husband and my children at home, which is quite abnormal. A Christian who attended a church service called by the pastor during the pandemic told reporters everyone was visibly afraid throughout the service. The anointing we received at church yesterday was very important to me and other members, but I'm not sure I will take the risk again next week. Another churchgoer said, God told me 3 days ago to spread the word that the spirit of coronavirus is dead. But this was in spite of her holding a hand sanitizer and having had her temperature taken before entering the church. The transformation of an unfamiliar disease, COVID-19, into common sense. If we go into social theory, Moscovici's study of the reception of psychoanalysis in France in the 50s showed that the images and ideas and languages shared by a social group always seem to dictate the initial direction which it tries to come to terms with the unfamiliar. Moscovici also observed that several modes of thought can coexist within the same individual or group. And this dynamic coexistence of distinct modalities of knowledge he referred to as a state of cognitive polyphasia. The intention of the communication of the Catholic press in Moscovici's study was to make limited concessions to a subgroup of Catholics with affinities for psychoanalysis and to simultaneously set limits to its acceptance within the church. I find similarities with the communication intentions of religious leaders and followers in the context of COVID-19, as they also sought to make concessions to science while maintaining their faith in God. The coexistence within the religious subgroup, however, showed the three routes outlined by Faladay and Bauer: the heretical, the complementary but parallel, and the complementary but enhancement routes. All forms can coexist in the same individual or in the same group. The communication intentions were hierarchical to elevate God above science. As in the case of the religious leader who said the pandemic is the wrath of God, the virus will be here until the whole world has had a compulsory holiday, until it proves to the whole world that he's God. They were heretical to elevate science. COVID-19 is a pandemic and must be dealt with as such. Complementary but parallel forms embraces both forms of knowing. The anointing we received at church yesterday was very important to me and other members. And complementary for enhancement, in which the pandemic was used to enhance faith in God, as Reverend Mbaka's statement that God will release a cure for the disease. The accommodation hypothesis approach likely defined the communication intentions of worshippers and leaders to the containment measures, and all forms coexisted in believers as a social group. Religious leaders, in searching for answers, adopted two broad strategies. One was to seek answers in faith. The other was to seek answers in science, either by accepting science or blaming science and scientists for a conspiracy against believers. The two strategies indicate that among religious believers, among the religious leaders, there coexist different communications serving different intentions. The believers adopted both science and faith, trusting God and scientists as they sought answers to the pandemic. How does a new common sense about a disease like COVID-19 emerge? How does it, what happens to it in the longitudinal, in the long run, as society continues to get more information about the disease? A new model of common sense, the Windrose model, proposed by Bauer and Gaskell, sees the stability of representations as a function of the subject, the object, the project, the time, the medium, and the intergroup context. The subject is a collective of conscious selves and others who come together for a project of common intentionality, while the medium is the genre of communication identified in relation to the object, and maybe propaganda, propagation, diffusion, rumor, conspiracy theories, or gossip. Also, representations are formed in relation to other communities, hence the intergroup context, and the object may change over time as a function of its own dynamics or in response to common sense. These are best reflected by subsequent communications of two of the religious leaders, which tended to walk back earlier claims about the virus and containment measures. Oyakhilome said, "I'm into healing. I know what it means for people to be sick. And so no matter how interested I am in 5G, I'm going to put health first. Are there health risks? I found that regulators didn't seem to care much." The Izala Muslim sect, led by Yahya, also issued a statement saying the group has concluded arrangements to support the ongoing sensitization on social distancing, self-isolation measures, which they now acknowledged Islam has recognized that we guard against the pandemic. I think that's about it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bankole. Okay, so next we have Anna Halifoff. She is Associate Professor in Sociology of Religion in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University in Australia.
Thank you, Carissa. Okay, can you see everything clearly there? All right. Okay, so I'm going to speak today about science and spirituality, and conspirituality in particular, in the Australian context. So before we applied for our small grants with the INSBS, we were already noticing some of these trends. And as Tom was saying too, before the pandemic, there was interest among scholars of religion in Australia in this substantive percentage rise of people who declare themselves to be spiritual. So in a major nationally representative survey that a team that I was on conducted on Australia's Generation Z, we found that 26% of young people aged 13 to 18 declared themselves to be either spiritual but not religious, or spiritual and religious, in a latent class analysis that we analysed these worldview types. So that's really quite a significant proportion. And to be honest, I was a little surprised about that myself, but that is how it is. Research on spirituality typically is not taken as seriously as research on religion in Australia, because it hasn't up until now really been associated with risk. There's been an enormous rise of interest in research on religious nuns, but we kind of know a lot about them already. So we were really interested in doing more work on spirituality and well-being in Australia, as I said before, well before the pandemic. I started to notice some really interesting things in terms of a nexus between science and spirituality. So the way that spiritual groups, and you can see it in these shows like Boop and Unwell and the Mind and Life Institute with the Dalai Lama and universities, is they're increasingly kind of using science to analyze and to prove and bolster kind of the benefits of their practices. And that this is a sort of, I think we've seen precedents of this before, even back to the turn of the previous century, as one of our research team, Alex Roginski, has been researching, and she's going to talk about this tomorrow night. But this real interest in using science in this way, I think, has really intensified in recent years. I also noticed a bit of a change with this kind of uptake of spirituality amongst men, these sciencey spiritual men who like to quote these, studies and these figures and quantum physics and science and everything in relation to some of their spiritual and well-being practices. We can see also this critique of science, critique of science within spirituality linked to this loss of faith in modernity, a loss of faith in modern medicine, a rise in interest in alternative therapies, and this kind of, disillusionment with Western modernity, Western science. And we saw this happening, already towards the end of the last century. And this rise of the vaccine hesitant and the anti-vaxxers, as Tom has already spoken about. And then the pandemic hits. And we have this rise in conspirituality. And this term was first used by scholars in 2011, David Voas and Charlotte Ward. And in the Australian press, there was a lot of alarm around these conspiritual theories, and has, the wellness realm fallen into conspiritualism during the time of the pandemic. And I think people were particularly concerned that people within spiritual movements were potentially radicalizing and moving into movements such as QAnon. So we applied for a grant. You can see our research team there through the INSBS. And today I'm just going to talk about briefly some preliminary findings and kind of recommendations and questions arising from the study. We've already hosted a colloquium, and Tom and Ma from this panel were speakers in this colloquium back in March, as was David Voas. And we're producing a special issue arising from that colloquium and our own research. We've been focusing on case studies of influencers, Pete Evans and these Aussie warriors, and also counter narratives within conspiritual movements or spirituality, broader movements in Australia. And we're also in the process of conducting a broader survey on spirituality and wellbeing in Australia that will inform this process also, and interviews with influencers. So here's a photo of one of the case studies we're looking at, is a dialogue with these Aussie warriors, as they have been labelled. So again, just very briefly, what we're noticing is these kind of exclusive religious and spiritual narratives that depict adherents as having access to the real truth, and thus being more enlightened than mainstream society, this kind of spiritual arrogance. We're really seeing that within these conspiritual movements. And it's a little bit similar to work that Tom's done on this kind of scarcity principle, if knowledge is seen to be something that's restricted or made secret or hidden from view. This seems to be something that's coming out quite strongly in our research as well. And of course, this is there in other new religious movements, not just in conspirituality. So it's very important that we understand this part of it. There is also the narratives of a great awakening, ascension, a harnessing of spiritual forces, very similar to other millennial kind of language. So once again, that's very much there in the narratives within these spiritual tribes. We're using the work of Nancy Ammerman here. And I think it's very, very helpful to look at the language, to look at, as Ma and her colleagues in Barcelona are looking at the aesthetic of these groups, their exclusive and distinct language and beliefs and codes as they call for this societal transformation. And that's what we're very much analysing in our case studies. Along with this is this sense of fear, and as Tom mentioned before, this sense of mistrust, a sense of persecution, that there are these supernatural dark forces. There's a paranoia, there's an anxiety, but there's also this kind of belief in ultimate vindication, that they have the one and only right view. They know what the real story is that's going on here, which again is very similar to other religious narratives and narratives that we've seen within new religious movements also. And as Aspram and Durandal and as Partridge and other people noticed, already years ago now, in response to the Voas and Ward study, is that this is not necessarily new to terrorism and occultism. And again, this is work that our research team in particular are looking at this in going back in history in Australia with spiritual movements, spiritualist movements. There is this crisis of trust, a crisis of truth that Paul Bramadat and Tom have noted in their previous research on state. And what we see during the pandemic is also these kind of economic dimensions where lockdowns threaten people's personal documentary, The Secret. So there's these sort of significant economic costs to people's very precarious livelihoods within this self-declared woo-woo industry. And what that has resulted in is what we've noted as a kind of mass spiritual bypassing also, where rather than actually acknowledge some of the real underlying issues of a pandemic, such like COVID-19 in terms of passing that, and where the more privileged and mostly white individuals inflicting often on the less privileged and the more vulnerable. Again, we have these influences, and other people have written about this in depth, about the kind of financial gain that these celebrities will get out of putting themselves forward as having these narratives and perpetuating these narratives. But I think we have to be careful here to think about that too much, because these exclusive sort of deep convictions of this consciousness shift and mission to overcome these dark forces are actually, very real for very many people. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to go very, very quickly through this. Inga First's work on religion problemized the term conspirituality because it's dangerous and is not radical. So it's important really not to sort of tar everyone with the same brush, not to ridicule those really going down this rabbit hole towards the far right and QAnon. They're quite sort of distinct discourses and tribes and groups within these movements. It's very important for us to understand the demographics and the dynamics of these subcultures, to use Bramadat's term here, and also to understand these underlying issues, and that we do need conventional legal approaches, but we have to be wary that they play into these narratives of persecution and look towards relational approaches as well. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Sorry, we were having we could hear you really well for most of that, but you started breaking up towards the end. But I think enough of your speech was able to come across, and then obviously we had the PowerPoint, so that.
I'm sorry about that.
No, not a problem. I know this is just the
sorry.
The world we live in with Zoom these days, isn't it? So, I might just ask you to keep your video off from now on. I think that will help with the connectivity, hopefully. All right. Thank you very, very much. Now we'll hand over to our final speaker, Mar Griera. Mar is Associate Professor in the Sociology Department at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carissa, and thank you very much to the Religious and Science team for organizing the conference. It's a real pleasure to be here. So after these great three speakers, I'm not sure what I can add, but I will give you a brief overview of the research that we are doing in Spain. This is not my only effort, but this is work that I've been doing together with Jordi Morales, who is an expert on big data analysis, and who is the main responsible for the big data analysis. So let me start by two very small preliminary remarks from the sociological perspective. The first one is that for me, it's interesting to take into account this analytical distinction between seeing the COVID-19 as a breaching experiment. If you are familiar with Harold Garfinkel and ethnomethodology, we can say that the COVID-19 has helped to shed light upon previously existing situation and helps to uncover tacit understandings embedded in the normative order of society. So to analyze COVID-19 allows us to understand better these religion and science entanglements, but at the same time, COVID-19, the pandemic, has been a trigger or a catalyst of new entanglements between science, religion, and spirituality that have fostered the articulation of new narrative and the creation of new public arenas and new actors constellations. So to some extent, to really take into account this double dimension of COVID-19 when we analyze it from a sociological perspective. In these preliminary remarks, I also would like to put forward that if COVID-19 becomes an interesting sociological research object, it's because we can also analyze how these boundaries between science and religion are not fixed or stable, but contingent and subject to constant negotiation and are evolving all the time. Also, this idea of the multiple levels and shapes of science, when we talk about science, as already been said in other sessions, there are many different meanings behind the idea of science. No, science as an horizon of possible futures, as an institution, as a concrete set of practices, and as many more. No, and in this, in our approach, we have taken the case of anti-vaccination movement as a window to explore the science, belief, and religion, spirituality entanglements, and in a way to take this anti-vaccination movement in the COVID-19 era as a form of understanding how these boundaries between science, religion, and belief are being formed and are being evolving. When we started to think about analyzing the anti-vax movement in Spain, we decided to take a multi-site approach in a way, and to develop it from 3 different perspectives. First, to check at the surveys, what the surveys were saying about this movement. Second, to do a big data analysis, and especially we have focused on the Twitter conversation, how the anti-vax Twitter conversation is developing. And finally, a qualitative fieldwork. I will just give you a very short ideas about each of these angles through which we analyze the anti-vax movement. The first one, the surveys. We have not done the surveys. These are done by the Fundación Española para la Ciencia y la Tecnología. And what's interesting to see is that in Spain, there's a strong support for COVID-19 vaccines. Nowadays, this is 87%. Only 4% of the population shows strong distrust against COVID-19 vaccines. And in this, only 0.3% of these 4% that are against anti-COVID-19 vaccines say that are for religious reasons. However, what's interesting in sociological terms is that 38% says that they are against for other reasons, which are not in the survey. So we really need to go deeper in order to understand. Some other small comments on this data. There are a lot of fluctuations. So we really see how these attitudes and these beliefs are changed quickly. Last July, more than 33% show a strong distrust against the vaccine. Nowadays, this number is really much lower. As you see, this is only 30%. And also, what does exactly to have some doubts mean? We don't really know through this perspective what's behind. This is what the surveys tell us. Then we have the big data. I will not go into the details. If someone of you is interested, we are going to publish an article into the ANA the special issue that Anna and the team are leading in Australia. But just to let you know that we have been checking to the main hashtags and been doing a Twitter analysis, and we have seen a bit the communities. But the main, these are the Spanish communities. We are the Spanish-speaking communities. We are not able to distinguish within the Spanish, but we see that the conversation are mainly among homophilic groups. But then what the main two conclusions of the big data analysis have been two. The first one is that the Twitter conversation is mainly a far-right conversation. So most of the influencers and most of the most popular hashtags are clearly conspirationist hashtags, views, and the main leaders or the main influencers in the conversation are those that are located into the far right position. So really far away, well, we can see a bit, but really far away from the original idea that we had of this spiritual anti-vaccination. If we see, for instance, this is a graph where we see the evolution of the anti-vax conversation in Twitter. We see that before the COVID, the anti-vax conversation in Spanish was really almost non-existent, and when was there was just related with some spiritual groups, alternative holistic spirituality groups. While in the COVID-19 times, there has been a far-right absorption of this spiritual anti-vax discourse. So we have these two angles, the surveys, the Twitter analysis, and then we have decided to do some qualitative fieldwork. This is still a work in progress, so we really need to go deeper into this, but just to give you some ideas of this qualitative fieldwork. When we went to they are not demonstration, but this kind of public complaints, meetings, organization, we see that then these spiritual leaders, this type of people that's involved into the spiritual movement, into the ecological movement, into the leftist milieu, are the ones that are taking the lead in organizing these small communities against vaccinations. So how to make sense of this new scenario of a survey that says that there's almost no opposition to vaccines, a big data that is mainly far-right discourses, anti-vax, and then a spiritual, ecological, leftist milieu that is organizing around these ideas. In a way, we realize that there's this together, but not a scrambles. When we talk about anti-vax movements, we see different moral entrepreneurs, different milieus, different networks, and even different aesthetics and memo styles. So we are, this is a complex, as Anna already said, this is a very complex scenario, and it's important to understand that many different perspectives are there. We also see that there are different mobilization repertoires, and in these different mobilization repertoires, different public arenas are being created. Usually the far-right organization do not mix with the spiritual organization, only in some kind of moment. For instance, in legal activism, we find some joint ventures. But it's interesting to see how these alliances and actors constellations are being transformed and shaped through the time. There are different levels of participation, and we can see how also the actors, we can locate them into different positions. So, and in order to conclude, just to give some time for the general discussion, our final question was, okay, there are similar questions, so that are being expressed or that are being articulated in this anti-vaccine movement or negationist or conspirationalist, we could go into detail, but are the same answers. And when we see, for instance, a question, why the pandemic? The pandemic become a rebelling even for many of these actors, but it's not revealing the same for everyone. So for the far right, it's revealing a conspiracy of the wall of the far of the lefties, of Soros, and so on. But for some alternative spiritual leader, maybe it's revealing that the climate change is real and we have really to do something. And so the diagnosis about the crisis is very different, despite the question is the same, and there is this will to answer this question. The second question, how to face the current situation. When we go beyond the no vaccine to me hashtag, when we try to go beyond the hashtag, we see that there are very different answers to this question, from healing remedies to microchips to the answers are from a very different type of answers. And finally, what future for humanity? And here it's interesting, and this is something that I would like to develop a bit more on the future, is how there are different imaginations. There's process of reimagining the past and reimagining the role of science in the past, reimagining why we are here now, what's the role of science and religion in creating this pandemic, but also how there are also different projected futures, and what's these futures are being conceptualized, and what role for science and religion are in this future. So this is a short overview of our research, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much to all of our speakers. What a fascinating lineup of talks. I really appreciate you all making the time to join us today and talk about your really fascinating research. So now I'd like to open up the floor for a Q&A. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I see we have one already. Yes, you can either put them in the chat or use the raise hand function and we can unmute you. I would just like to take chair's privilege for 1 second to just comment on these papers overall. I think what's so fascinating to me is that across all of these papers, we've seen that there are a variety of positions that people have, right? When you think about anti-vax, for example, or you think about the way Bankole was talking about how people have different ways of engaging with religion and science, either accommodation or preferencing one over the other or something like that. So that there's not one narrative with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and how science and religion are made sense of for individuals in society. So yes, thank you so much. And let's go ahead and go to our questions in the chat. So the first one we have is from Gladys, who says, I have a question to Dr. Marr. In your research, you found 87% who trust COVID-19 vaccine, 13% who doubted, and 4% who do not trust. This adds up to 104%. Oops. Yes, okay, sorry. Which is more than 100%. So if you could just kind of clarify that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's me that I did a mistake. It's 83%. I just put the link to the research survey. So if anyone is interested, you can download it.
Thank you very much.
My dyslexia.
Thank you. Okay, and the next question is from Isa. Great presentations and insights from you all. My question is for Dr. Falade. We've seen accommodations by some religious leaders towards science. Could we argue that the accommodations only arise because people behave the way they do because it gives them what they want? However, we only engage in alternatives when the previous behaviors or beliefs fail to get us what we want.
I'm not sure if that is the perspective of that is what informed some of these communications. It's not always about having to choose between two fields, two knowledge systems. It's almost always about how to live with both of them if you want to have both. For the religious leaders, it's at times somebody has talked to me that it's about their survival. You know, the whole model of going to church and everything is about faith, and then COVID comes and they can't do anything about it. You know, Oyakhilome has a healing ministry, and then he can't stop COVID, and then he tries to find another way out and says, "Look, this is a conspiracy against God." It's a very complex situation. People have all kinds of belief systems. It's not just about religion or about science or about believing in God. There are different kinds of beliefs, and the way it plays out for all of us in our daily lives it can be different. You know, she goes to church with the hand sanitizer, she has her temperature taken, and she goes to church, she says she wants anointing, she wants another layer of protection. Oh, God, protect me, but I've done what the scientists say. You know, but God, I still want you to protect me. We've found this in other conversations as well. When we had the Ebola virus disease and people say, look, yes, the science is there, but may God not allow you to meet somebody who has the virus and then you catch it. And then so there's this fuzziness about where you go, what you do, how it makes you likely to catch the disease or not catch the disease. So there's still quite a few things that science has not been able to explain. And if we go to the beginning of this whole crisis, it's not that science had an explanation at the beginning. You know, we were all a little bit confused about what was really going on. Will it leave China? No, some people said, no, it's not going to leave China. And then it left China. And then it got to the US. And then it got to New York. And then it came to Africa. And then it started going all over the place. And then we thought it would cause some serious devastation in Africa, but somehow it's not as bad as we thought it's going to be. So there's a lot of going back and forth between knowledge systems, and people try to find some kind of, I don't like calling it middle road. I prefer to say they're just accommodating both knowledge systems. I hope I did answer that question.
Thank you. So Samuel has raised his hand. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to unmute. There we go. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me? Good morning.
Can.
Okay, good morning. Okay, my question goes to Dr. Bankole Falade. Before I ask my question, I'm so impressed with the number of presentations this morning. All the presenters, I really enjoyed the presentation. And more importantly, Dr. Bankole, I really enjoy your presentation, and your approach of presentation was so impressive to me as an early researcher just coming up. My question is concerning some of the views of theologians. Yeah, I wanted to ask if your research did not consider theologians who are scientists also, because looking at the names of the faith-based leaders from the Muslim and the Christian perspective, all of them are, they are into religious beliefs. My question is, if your research did not consider faith leaders like Dr. D.K. Olukoya, who is an expert in molecular genetics, at the same time is a faith healer. So my question is, was it a deliberate approach by your research to exclude scientists who at the same time are theologians?
There was no deliberate attempt to exclude anybody. The research is not finished. It's an ongoing thing. I haven't really finished all the data, and this was limited to I tried to limit it to 10 minutes. There's still a lot of material that I didn't use, so many others that I didn't use. But if you look at somebody like Pastor Adeboye, he has a PhD, I think in mathematics or physics. All these guys we are talking about are serious scientists. They are all very, very serious scientists. I don't think any one of them has lower than a first degree. All of them are serious scientists. I know Olukoya, his church is not too far from where I am now on the express. I know what he is into. He's into deliverance, and he even has a university. They all have universities. They are all scientists. They know what science is. They also know what their belief systems is. How they live with both it's what we're trying to do all the time. And it's not about rejecting science or completely diffusing science. It's always about how they want to accommodate both into knowledge systems. It's something we all do with other fields, but when it comes to science, we think it's a bit, when it comes to religion, we think it's a bit tricky, but we have to live with politics, we have to live with law, we have to live with so many other things, and somehow we find it somewhere within us to live with all of them at the same time. Yes, I know Pastor Olukoya very well, and I know his ministry.
Thank you. All right, we have a question from Siri saying, going by the last presentation, it seems there are parallel discourses going on simultaneously in different domains. And I think we've seen that across several of the presentations. Where and when do these discourses intersect?
Thank you, Siri, for the question. I think it's really interesting to see how these conversations are being held in the different spheres, but at some moments in time, they converge. For instance, as I was saying, we have seen that in some legal activism, the spiritual anti-vax movements and the more far-right movements have created some associations, at least in Spain, that are working together in order, for instance, go to the tribunals and to sue the government in this kind of issues. So they find spaces of alliance and where they feel comfortable among themselves, and spaces where they don't feel comfortable. So some anti-vax spiritual groups maybe go together for a spiritual retreat or a meeting, or where it's difficult that some far-right leaders would join them. So, but we really need more research in order to understand better how these actors constellations are being created and are being transformed, because they are changing quickly. But maybe Anna or Tom or Bankole know a bit more about, because I think that also there's a strong national component and local dynamics that plays a role there, because in every country the history of the movements and the history of the public institutions also has a role in shaping this question.
Yeah, look, I think that's right. And I think in terms of where they converge and where they overlap, again, I would go back to that proxy of trust and distrust. And so what unites quite divergent. So previous to studying anti-vaccination, vaccine hesitancy, I studied anti-evolutionism. And there's in the people that the groups that I've studied, there's much more uniformity in terms of the people that are, let's say, anti-evolutionist or creationist. But in terms of people opposed to vaccines or people who are hesitant to vaccine, you're dealing with a much more diverse cohort. But I do think that there's something to be said that the unifying feature of those cohorts is who they trust and distrust. So who do they trust in their family over credible authorities or politicians? Do they trust, what information do they trust? As opposed to, let's say, government information and these sorts of things. So a lot of it, I still think, personally, I think a lot of, one of the strong unifying features of disparate vaccine hesitant groups is that whether who do they trust and who don't they trust.
Yeah, just briefly, I would agree. Can you hear me okay, Carissa? Do you want me to turn my video off? Okay, so far. Yeah, I would agree with the distrust, as Tom said, but I think there's also other parallels that, like I mentioned in my talk. So things like these exclusive narratives, this sense of having a privy access to the truth, a higher truth. I think that's there across many of them. This sense of a great awakening, the sense that we're living in some kind of apocalyptic end time, the fact that there's some kind of dark forces, and also that sense of mission to do something about it, you know? And as Maya said, it is about these imaginations of creating an alternative reality, you know, and overcoming this dark towards this great awakening. So I think, you know, I am reminded here a little bit too of like horseshoe theory and in Tom's presentation too, where the right and the left can also converge sometimes on some of these points, which, you know, is a theory that people have, not always been so positive about, but it comes up in these movements as well. So yes.
If I can make a quick comment. Before, I think 2018, the Wellcome Trust did a survey of 100+ countries, and they looked at vaccine hesitancy. We were not expecting COVID then. They were looking at vaccine hesitancy using 3 variables: importance of vaccines, safety of vaccines, and the effectiveness of vaccines. And we've been looking at the data for a few months now. And if you look across Africa, at least from the analysis I've done, you will find that trust in science or trust in scientific research, trust in science and scientists always have a role to play, but it depends on which country, and it depends on the kind of conversations you have in those countries. So culture also makes, culture is also important. What I found very striking was that there were high levels of hesitancy. There were different levels of hesitancy between English-speaking African countries and French-speaking African countries. The French-speaking African countries were as high as France is in Europe compared with the rest of Europe. And it was the same we found in the French-speaking African countries. So the kind of conversations they are listening to, the English guys always tune to BBC, and the other ones, the French guys tune to AFP, and the other ones, you know, so the influence of the conversations they have locally is also very important in how they shape their views about vaccines. I found it completely surprising that you will find that dissimilarity between English and French. The French ones were really very high up there, and the English ones were low there. And if you look at the predictors, we did a logistic regression. If you look at the predictors, you will see things like gender being very important when it comes to things like safety. Yes, I know in Africa, it's the mother who takes the child to the clinic. It's the mother who is almost always responsible for everything. So she's worried. She's more worried than the husband. So you get even things like education matters in some countries, knowledge matters in some countries. It's a very complex issue, you know. But this was before the COVID crisis. They were looking at resistance to vaccines in other contexts. Now that we have COVID, maybe we have something we can use to compare what is before and what is after. It's a very interesting data set from Wellcome Trust.
Very interesting, thank you. All right, next we have a very practical question from Roel, who asks, how can I convince my father, who is a pastor, who does not want to get the vaccine? Does anyone want to take a stab at this?
That's a very tough one. He just has to get the vaccine. I think what we've probably learned more, like I was looking at the data today and a report from CNN saying that in some parts of the US, some people who have taken the vaccine have died, some who didn't take it have died, and they're trying to compare the proportion of those who took it and died and those who didn't take it and die. And the issue of comorbidity was not there, where they, you know, is it now, are we now at the probably horrible flu number of annual deaths a year that you have? So it's a very complex issue. But I think generally it's like what we call the diffusion curve. You know, some people are going to be early adopters, some people are going to be late adopters. It's trying to get the late adopters to come on board very quickly, much faster than we want them to do. A lot of people are going to sit and look and say, let me see what is going on. I've been trying to convince a friend of mine for the past few weeks to get the vaccine. He doesn't want to get it, you know, and each time he asks me to shake his hand, I will tell him, I'm protected, you are not protected, go get the vaccine. And he just looks at me, you know. But there will always be the diffusion thing. There will be early adopters and late adopters. It's just to shorten the time that we have to work on. You know, I'm sure he's going to take it eventually.
Look, you know, my first piece of advice is take this massive open online course that's free called AVAX 101, Anti-Vaccination and Vaccine Hesitancy. It does provide modules on how to address vaccine hesitancy and people's opposition. But you know, the immediate lesson that we have from the data and research into how to better address vaccine hesitancy is that very little actually works, unfortunately. So that's the downside. But I mean, general guidelines are discard the knowledge deficit model. So most people do not make decisions on their vaccines based on knowledge. In fact, increasing people's knowledge has been found to not improve vaccine behaviors and can actually be counterproductive. Often education is not a correlative factor in vaccine decision making. So discard the fact that just improving, let's say, your father's information about the vaccine will change his behaviors. But you know, be respectful, audience focused, avoid verbal aggression, be honest and open to questions. So just keep dialogue open and acknowledge people's fears about the vaccine, your father's fears about the vaccine. In terms of just, you know, simple things to do is, you know, learn how to debunk better. So debunking vaccine myths actually can be done in a more strategic way. So always try to debunk by mentioning a fact first before the myth, then warn about the myth, let's say the vaccine myth, explain what's wrong with the myth, and then mention the fact again. It's called like a fact sandwich. But yeah, that's just, you know, basic, quick and dirty understanding. But it is very, very difficult. All the data finds that it's very difficult to convince people who are opposed to vaccines to get vaccines.
Thank you very much, Tom. I know you've done a lot of work on this, so thank you. Now, we have a question from Stephen asking a question for all speakers, but perhaps most relevant to the Australian speakers. What do you think the COVID pandemic and vaccine hesitancy can tell us about the categories of religion and belief and how useful they are in analyzing social changes or phenomena?
Thank you, Stephen. So I think it's an excellent question. And I think on purpose in our study, we are very much drawing on Meredith McGuire's work and Nancy Ammerman's work and other people who are kind of problematizing kind of narrow views of what religion and belief entail and looking more towards a model of lived and everyday religion. And in our case, because we're looking at spirituality, lived and everyday spirituality. And as I said in my presentation, you know, we in Australia, if you want context specific, you know, our census obviously doesn't ask people any questions about their spirituality. It's just about religious affiliation, and that doesn't really tell you much at all. So if you're wanting to understand, and you know, Tom's data sitting next to our preliminary data, and Tom's obviously more robust, you know, a big quantitative data set, when he has presented on those, you know, where does religion fit in with vaccine hesitancy? As he said early on, it's not necessarily, you know, the main reason for someone to be hesitant, but it is there as a high proportion of people who are hesitant are religious or spiritual. So we clearly need to understand the complexities within that realm of how we think about what religion and belief is. And we need to look at things like hybridity. We do need to look at those, we did this latent class analysis in our Australian Generation Z study to define these 6 worldview types that have overlaps, the spiritual and not religious, for example, or the spiritual and religious. So yeah, I think that those models and theories around complexity, hybridity, when understanding the religious, spiritual, and the non-religious is really, really important.
Well, look, I actually have a problem with the use of the term belief. And I've mentioned it to people in the INSBS. Because belief, for one, from a religious studies perspective, belief favors certain religious perspectives, particularly Christian perspectives, that are all about belief, where historically, and in a lot of religious contexts, orthopraxis, so right action is much more important than belief. So belief is it's a very problematic category, and it's a problematic category also from a sociological perspective, because belief assumes that you can know the mind of the person that you're reporting on, that you can say this person believes this or these people believe that, and we don't necessarily know what they believe. We can just know what they report, perhaps, that they believe, or their affiliation. And so, this is why, of course, sociology is often delimited to religiosity and religious self-identification. And that's really as far as we can go in quantitative data. You really need to do some heavy qualitative data to start getting at something like belief. But I actually have a problem. So if PhD students of mine, say, oh, this person believes in that, I actually have a problem with that category for a number of reasons.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. So I think that rather than taking any more of the questions from the Q&A, I will just encourage anyone who has additional questions to consider reaching out to our speakers on Whova, which is the platform for this conference. So you can message them if you have any questions for the speakers individually. And just in the couple minutes that we have left, do any of our speakers have any final thoughts that they would like to raise?
Just to thank you for organizing the panel. I think that has been a really interesting discussion, and I think that there are some elements that are or deserve still to keep the conversation going. No, on the one hand, the theoretical debate, what we mean by belief, what we mean by anti-vax movement, for instance, what we mean by religion, the role of spirituality. With Anna together, we have discussed a lot about this. And then the comparison between regions and countries, and trying to understand how different geographic contexts deal differently with the same questions. No? So thank you for organizing this, because I think that this is a long-term conversation, or at least has the potentialities to be. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mar. Any other final comments from our speakers?
Just to say thank you as well for keeping the conversation going. We were supposed to be drinking wine in South Africa, and COVID has put us all online. So hopefully we'll welcome you to South Africa sometime next year.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's my hope as well. I definitely think there's some lovely advantages to doing virtual conferences, but also nothing is quite going to replace being able to sit in a room together, drinking your beverage of choice.
Yep.
So, thank you so much again, Mar, Bankole, Anna, and Tom. This has been a really, really fantastic and illuminating session. I really appreciate you coming along and sharing your thoughts with us. Thank you very much.